Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us this morning. So welcome to our webinar today on how to prevent and manage a data breach in your business. So my name's Olivia O'Rourke. I'm a senior associate in LegalVision's commercial team. And what we'll be going through today is some sort of basically how to prevent and deal with a data breach in your business. Before we get into things, just a couple of quick housekeeping items. So you'll receive a recording of today's presentation and the slides in your email afterwards. As we go along today, please feel free to submit any questions in the Q&A box, and we'll aim to answer those at the end of today's webinar. And if you could please complete the feedback questionnaire after the webinar, that would be fantastic. We really appreciate any feedback that we get on these webinars. So that would be great. Just another item to touch on as well, for the next 48 hours, you're eligible for a free consultation with LegalVision to discuss how we can help your business specifically. So if you provide your contact details in the survey at the end of the webinar, one of our team members will be in touch so we can discuss your particular circumstances. Brilliant. So let's get into today's agenda. So we'll be discussing obviously what is a personal data breach, the key steps to dealing with a personal data breach, what your notification obligations are under the GDPR, what should those notifications contain, and personal data breach prevention. So what can you put in place to help prevent that from happening in the future? And then finally, we'll finish with a Q&A to answer some of your questions. All right, so let's get into things. So firstly, what is a personal data breach? So the definition of personal data breach comes from the Data Protection Act, which is essentially the UK GDPR. And what it means is a breach of security leading to the accidental or unlawful destruction, loss, alteration, unauthorized disclosure of or access to personal data. So obviously, as you can see, it's breaches as a result of both accidental and deliberate causes. And it's more than just losing personal data. But as you can see, it involves quite a few scenarios. So some examples of personal data breaches include access to personal data by an authorized third party, for example, a hacker, deliberate or accidental action or inaction by a data controller or a data processor, sending personal data to the incorrect recipient, for example, sending an email to the wrong person, basically computing devices containing personal data being stolen or lost. So for example, leaving a laptop on the train or having a phone being stolen, alteration of personal data without permission, and the loss of availability of personal data as well. So in summary, there'll be a personal data breach whenever personal data is accidentally lost, destroyed, corrupted, or disclosed, if it's accessed or passed on without proper authorization, or if the data is made unavailable and that unavailability has a significant negative impact on individuals. So I guess in terms of, what would happen if you discover a personal data breach? Well, the key steps to dealing with a personal data breach, they'll often sort of mold into you'll be doing certain things at the same time. But certainly the key steps when dealing with the data breach include firstly to detect and contain the breach. So once you detect what's happened, it's obviously then looking to contain contain the breach, stop it from occurring if it's an ongoing breach. Identify obviously the breach and its scope, how many people have been affected, what has been accessed, the scope of the breach. Obviously taking immediate action to stop or limit the breach if it's the result of unauthorized access by, for example, a hacker into security systems, obviously looking to try and shut that down and to get advice from third parties, including IT experts, on how to deal with that. Then it's assessing the risk. So once you've taken the immediate action to try and contain the breach, it's assessing the risk. So what is the risk to individuals as a result of this breach? that sort of flows into the next section, which is obviously evaluating the impact on the data subjects who have been affected. So what is the potential impact for them, and what could happen now given what breach has occurred and who now has access to that personal data. The next step is obviously, again, to notify the Information Commissioner's office, who is the regulator here in the UK, and we'll talk through in just a moment when a breach is notifiable to the ICO, but certainly it is, part of that initial sort of step is to assess whether there is a notification requirement there. This is all happening obviously in the very early stages of a data breach, and you're trying to sort of, as much as we have sort of stepped these out, these things are kind of all happening, simultaneously often. So what are your notification obligations for a personal data breach? As we've just touched on, there may be an obligation to notify the ICO of a personal data breach. You might also be required to notify the affected individual who the data breach has, impacted, or whose personal data has been breached. So we'll briefly talk through when you might be required to notify one or both of these parties, rather. So firstly, notifying the ICO. So when is that required? So the notification obligation comes from Article 33 of the GDPR, and essentially a personal data breach is notifiable to the ICO within 72 hours of discovering the personal data breach, unless the personal data breach is unlikely to result in a risk to the rights and freedoms of natural persons. So obviously the default position is you need to notify the ICO within 72 hours of discovering the breach, unless it's unlikely to result in a risk to the rights and freedoms of natural persons. So whether the personal data breach is unlikely to result in a risk to the rights and freedoms of natural persons is going to need to be assessed on a case-by-case basis. It will typically be where the breach is likely to have a significant detrimental impact on individuals. So for example, is there the potential for harm? So for example, is it sort of a situation that could lead to physical or material damage to individuals? So could someone potentially be at physical risk as a result of their personal data being breached? Is there an impact on personal rights? So the risk to privacy, the risk to data protection, freedom of expression or other fundamental rights that an individual has. Is there a risk of discrimination? So as a result of this information being shared, is there a result that they could suffer unfair treatment based on the data that's now been released? Is there a risk of financial loss, so identity theft or fraud? Obviously, that's a really, unfortunately, big one and a common one that we see in a business context, and obviously, in an individual context, is identity theft or fraud being a real reason for some sort of unauthorized access of personal data. Is there potentially reputational damage? So could there be a risk of social or professional harm as a result of the information that's been exposed? Obviously, loss of confidentiality, so other things that could be being exposed that are protected by professional secrecy, and obviously economic or social disadvantage. So is there a situation where the breach could negatively impact their opportunities or their standing? So the ICO advises organisations to consider the severity and likelihood of the risk when making this assessment. Obviously, it's case by case, as we've just said, but when in doubt, it's often safer to notify the ICO. Not every breach reported to the ICO results in formal action. The ICO's main aim is just to provide advice and guidance to the business that's going through the data breach and to help it avoid similar situations in the future. So when in doubt, really the message is to notify the ICO. In terms of how to notify the ICO, you'll just need to notify them by visiting their website and filling in the form, which prompts you to report a personal data breach. So it's quite straightforward. Now, obviously, I mentioned that there is potentially, needing to notify the affected individual as well. So that obligation comes from Article 34 of the GDPR, And the threshold for notification to the affected individual is slightly different. So the threshold is you will need to notify the affected individual about the personal data breach, where the data breach is likely to result in a high risk to the rights and freedoms of the individual. So as you can see, with that high risk threshold, it is slightly higher than the threshold required to notify the ICO. Now, what is defined as high risk is not set out in legislation. However, you should essentially consider whether the breach is likely to have a serious negative effect on the individual. So, for example, high risk could be things like, obviously a risk that their identity could be stolen, if there's likely to be irreversible damage caused by the breach to the individual in any form, and especially where it involves special category data, such as health information. So obviously if someone's health records, diagnoses, medication, things like that is released or disclosed to a third party, that could obviously have a high risk to them. So the notification time frame is also slightly different to the notification time frame when notifying the ICO. It's without undue delay. So it's as soon as reasonably possible after becoming aware of the high risk. Now, there's no specific time frame, unlike that 72-hour requirement for notifying the ICO. It's just without undue delay. So obviously, quite quickly after discovering the risk. And the risk is, obviously, I suppose the point of that is really to notify the individual so that they can take steps to mitigate the risk to themselves. Now, you don't need to notify the individual. So obviously you do that assessment of whether there's a high risk to the rights and freedoms of individuals. Even if it does fall into that category where it could be a high risk to the individual, you don't need to notify them if you've sort of implemented appropriate technical and organizational measures, which were applied to the personal data breach. For example, the data has now been securely encrypted. You've taken subsequent measures to ensure that the high risk to the rights and freedoms of individuals is no longer likely to materialize. So maybe originally when the data was released, there was a high risk. Perhaps an email was sent to the wrong recipient containing, say, health records, but perhaps you've been able to contact the recipient and ensure that they've deleted that email without reading it, for example. That might be a scenario where you've ensured that that's no longer likely to materialize, or if it would involve a disproportionate effort to contact individuals. So just given the nature and the size of the data breach. In any event, I think what's really important for businesses to take away is that you should record your decisions on whether to notify the ICO and or the affected individual, and keep a record of this. So let's just say that in future, a data subject finds out about this and they make a complaint to the ICO, and the ICO questions how you handled that data breach. If you've got, records to show sort of how you made those decisions in respect to the data breach, how you determined that there wasn't a high risk to individuals and that's why you didn't notify the individual, or, whatever the circumstances are, your business is going to be in a much stronger position, certainly to avoid punishment by the ICO, but certainly also to demonstrate, to the data subject that you had their best interests at heart. Now, we've talked about the notification obligations, but what should the notification contain? So if you need to notify the ICO, the notification to the ICO should contain a description of the nature of the personal data breach. For example, where possible, the categories and approximate number of individuals that have been affected, and the categories and number of data records that have been affected. So not only the number of individuals, but also the number of data records affected. The name and contact details of your data protection officer, if you have one, or otherwise another contact point where more information can be obtained. Description of the likely consequences of the personal data breach, and a description of the measures that you have taken or proposed to take to deal with the personal data breach. And obviously, where appropriate, the measures you have already taken to mitigate any possible adverse effects prior to notifying the ICO. Now, if you need to notify individuals, the notification will look a little different. Obviously the language needs to be reflective of the fact that you're dealing with individuals, not the ICO, who is obviously well-versed in data protection legislation and language. So keep that in mind, obviously, when drafting any notification to an individual. But what you should be including is a summary of the breach. Again, also the contact details of your data protection officer, or who they can contact if they have more information or need more information or have questions. An explanation on a really practical level of the potential risk to the individual. Details again of the actions that you've taken or planned to address the breach, and any sort of practical steps that you recommend the individual takes to protect themselves from any harm. So obviously a really common one would be update your password, sort of clear directions for the individual on what they can do to make sure that any sort of potential risk is less likely to materialize. Now, obviously, as I said, that language needs to reflect the fact that you're communicating with individuals, and obviously you don't want to cause too much fear, but you need to be as accurate and direct as possible with the individual. So we've talked about obviously what is a personal data breach, when you need to notify, and what that notification needs to contain. But I think obviously the really important thing that businesses need to consider is, obviously you don't want to be dealing with a personal data breach in the first place. So what can you do to sort of help position the business so, you can do your best to prevent a personal data breach? It's obviously one of those things that it can't always be avoided, but certainly a business can put in place measures to mitigate that risk. So Article 5.1(f) of the GDPR concerns the integrity and confidentiality of personal data. And basically the GDPR says that, you need to process personal data in a way that it's appropriate, there's appropriate security for the personal data, including protection against unauthorized or unlawful processing, accidental loss, destruction, or damage. And you need to implement appropriate technical and organizational measures. So what that means for every business is going to be really different, obviously, depending on the types of personal data that you're collecting about individuals. What is considered appropriate, for that type of personal data will be slightly different. Obviously, when you're dealing with special category data, health data, those types of, categories, you're going to need to put in place more secure technical measures to protect that. So the first thing would be obviously store personal data securely. Now, most businesses these days are storing their records on computer systems, on cloud systems. There's still a place for businesses that do store hard copy records. And of course, we won't focus on that too much in today's webinar, but certainly taking, practical steps to secure hard copy records is a no-brainer. But for electronically stored records, implement multi-factor authentication for logins to your systems, for your staff. Also sort of regularly update, review, and limit access permissions. So who has access to certain types of personal data within the business. Obviously, it should only be, those who have a need to know that personal data to fulfill their job requirements. Use data encryption tools so that data is encrypted both at rest and in transit, so that there's less risk of that being sort of obtained unlawfully. Another sort of, again, for electronic records, using secure network infrastructure. So using firewalls and intrusion detection prevention systems. Obviously, there's lots of those on the market. Using reputable software providers. We've seen this year that not every reputable service provider is safe from any sort of data breach or sort of security malfunction, but certainly, you're obviously putting your business in a better position if you're using a reputable software provider. Checking their data processing addendum. is a big one. You obviously need to be agreeing to that before you share personal data with them of your customers, employees, that sort of thing, to ensure that they are complying with the GDPR as your processor. But also it shows that they've got a commitment to the GDPR where their documents are up to date and compliant. And conducting regular security audits of your systems and networks. Obviously, there's penetration testing that can be done to identify any holes or gaps in your system, and that will be really important, just consistently to identify any vulnerabilities and to fix those. Now, some other sort of things you can do aside from sort of the infrastructure and sort of the software would be to prepare internal policies for paperwork and data retention. So the majority of personal data breaches actually are not from things like sort of cybersecurity breaches, are actually from non-cyber incidents. So typically those are things like an email being sent to the wrong recipient, phishing, so accidentally sending personal data to someone posing as someone else, those types of situations. So you're going to need to sort of really train your staff, to be aware of those kinds of incidents, so phishing incidents, or, to make sure that there's, for example, really clear instructions on naming documents, particularly if you're dealing with patient reports, patient records. We definitely see that a lot come through to us is, where reports or things like that, particularly health reports, aren't labeled correctly and are accidentally sent to the wrong patient. So it's really important that you've got sort of, for example, naming conventions for files, so that your staff have clear instructions on sending those types of records. Obviously instructions as well on storing hard copy documents, so where they should be saved. And a really important thing is obviously data retention. So really clear policies internally for what you need to retain of customer records and for how long. You need to review those and obviously dispose of any unnecessary personal data once it's reached the time frame for which you no longer need it. So some personal data you'll need for the statute of limitations period, some you'll need for other statutory periods of time. Once you no longer need the personal data, it should be removed from your system and unable to be accessed or reverse engineered in the future. And then lastly, a data breach response plan. This is a plan that is really sort of targeted for how to deal with a data breach response, for a response to a data breach. Essentially, it should set out, how to identify a personal data breach, who in the business is responsible for managing and leading that data breach response, and what actions must be taken. So obviously summarizing what we've discussed in today's webinar, documenting that internally so that everyone has a really clear understanding of what needs to happen if a data breach occurs internally within the business. Just on a really practical level, the National Cybersecurity Centre, which is the NCSC, has some really useful resources on their website for businesses, including practical steps to maintain cybersecurity. So I would definitely recommend checking that out. Obviously, when we're talking about cybersecurity, we're not cybersecurity experts. Our job is to sort of advise on the law, but certainly always recommend engaging with a cybersecurity expert to sort of discuss system security, online security, device security for your devices that you sort of give to staff. And depending on your sophistication and requirements, obviously a cybersecurity expert will be able to advise you on the best processes for your business. I suppose they just need to be obviously appropriate for the size and the scale of the personal data that you are processing and have access to. And obviously just to sort of take into account the costs involved in implementation, which is obviously a factor for small businesses. A really good starting point for cybersecurity is just to make sure that you're in line with the requirements of Cyber Essentials, which is a government scheme that includes a really basic set of technical controls that you can put in place quite easily. It is very much a baseline, but that is called Cyber Essentials if you need to look that up and obviously look to implement that within your business. So that includes the main part of our webinar today. Before we get into the Q&A, here is our personal data breach notification fact sheet that we've put together, which we hope will be just a useful fact sheet, very simple, that you can refer back to if you have any queries around personal data breaches. Please feel free to use the QR code to download that fact sheet. So I'll just give you a moment there. Perfect. The next thing, just to sort of make you aware of, is we're always running these webinars on various topics. So our next webinar that we've got is refunds, returns and repairs, your business's legal obligations. So if you can join us, it would be great to have you. So similar time next week, Tuesday, the 15th of October, 11 a.m. Again, just while we're giving you a chance to ask any questions, I'll just run through briefly what we offer at LegalVision. So at LegalVision, we basically are a membership law firm. So by becoming a LegalVision member, your business gets unlimited access to our full team of over 100 specialist lawyers for your business as usual legal needs. So it's like having an in-house counsel for a fraction of the cost. And it's really great for us to be able to service small businesses who maybe haven't had the budget for lawyers in the past. So our team can assist you with unlimited document drafting and reviewing of business contracts, unlimited legal advice consultations, unlimited domestic trademark applications in the UK, and much more. So as a LegalVision member, you won't worry about the cost of lawyers ever again. So it's like, we'll take care of all of your business as usual legal work. So you can focus on running your business, but have peace of mind that you've got lawyers assisting you on the back end. If you're in-house counsel, we also offer a dedicated service to manage your high volume business's usual legal needs as well. So to learn about how membership or desk extension, which is our in-house assistance product, can help you, please request that free consultation at the end of this webinar when the survey appears, and we can certainly look to address your personal legal needs. Brilliant. So we might get into the Q&A then. Let's have a quick look at some of these questions. So what are the most common types of personal data breaches? I suppose we've touched on that a little bit. The data, as I said, released by the ICO in the past years definitely reflected that most of the personal data breaches that are reported to them are non-cyber related incidents. So those are things like obviously emails being sent to the wrong recipient, a failure to redact information when sending it to a third party, or phishing, which is unfortunately becoming more and more common. So with phishing, you'll often see, for example, an email received, it's being posed, for example, as the CEO of the business or a manager of a business trying to email you and ask you to send them personal data. Or often with a financial gain as being the kind of the ammunition for that. And also, they could be potentially posing as a client as well and asking you to send them information. So just really important that your team are aware of how to deal with non-cyber related potential data breach risks, making sure that they know what to kind of look for with a phishing email, and know how to sort of address that. So I guess that's probably the main common types of personal data breaches. Obviously, we traditionally think of a data breach of, as being a hacker sort of hacking into systems and sort of taking personal data and selling that off to third parties or leaking that publicly. But the reality is, whilst that obviously does happen and that can have a really detrimental impact on the business, and particularly at a large scale, the reality is that the majority of personal data breach incidents are non-cyber and do involve just human error, or for example, giving access to personal data to someone that really shouldn't have access to it. And for example, a disgruntled employee or a disgruntled contractor who's left the business, and they take that and contact that third party. So just really be aware of those kinds of non-cyber related personal data breach risks, and just put in place measures, for example, knowledge and training for your employees. Okay. The potential financial penalties for data breaches. Well, certainly the potential financial penalty for failing to report a data breach is the maximum fine is the greater of 17.5 million or 4% of the organization's annual global turnover, whichever is higher. So obviously that is a huge amount of money that potentially is at risk there. Typically the ICO's approach is not to necessarily give out the maximum fine, certainly not in the first instance. The fine imposed would depend on various factors, including the severity of the breach, the organization's level of responsibility, how sophisticated they are, how much they probably should have known, how to prevent that type of personal data breach, any mitigating actions that the business has taken to deal with the personal data breach. And they're almost certainly also going to look at the histories, sort of the business's history of compliance. So whether, these types of data breaches have arisen before for the business. They're certainly looking for repeat offenders, the ICO. And so certainly if, you've had a data breach before and you failed to implement the measures that could have avoided it the second time around, that's certainly going to be an aggravating factor when the ICO are dealing with fines or punishment for that particular data breach. What can a business do to prevent a data breach is another question that we have. I guess obviously we've discussed putting in place, various policies and procedures, putting in place cyber measures relative to the sophistication of your systems and also the size of your business, as well as sort of taking into account the types of personal data that you are storing. So obviously a business with minimal amounts of personal data, whilst they need to put in place appropriate security measures, which is a requirement under the GDPR, it's going to look, what is appropriate for them is going to look quite different to a different type of business dealing with, large amounts of health records or large amount of personal data records. So obviously those sort of really practical measures we've discussed. The other sort of thing to flag as well is, for some businesses, cyber insurance is going to be, super important, particularly if there is really a real risk of, certainly financial risk, but also the potential risk and fines available to that business for a breach of GDPR. It might not be appropriate for every single business, but certainly cyber insurance could be relevant. So it's important to chat to your insurance broker to determine if cyber insurance is appropriate for your business and for your legal needs, to obviously protect against that financial risk that could arise. I think just really the most important thing at a really, really practical level is just to make sure that staff are really aware of the GDPR. They're aware of how to deal with a potential data breach. They're aware of what is a data breach, because obviously sending an email to the wrong person is not something that every person would consider or think that that's a data breach automatically. So it's just really about sort of, implementing training for your team to make sure that they're really aware of what could happen, and the significant risk to the business if they don't notify managers and staff in a timely manner, because obviously, the financial risk and penalty is super significant, not only for the business, but also for the potential risk to the individual for the longer you leave an unresolved, potential data breach. So it's just about, really ensuring that staff are aware internally of what a data breach is and how to resolve that. So that data breach response plan that we talked about will be really important. Okay, I can't see that there are any other questions. If anyone else just has any additional questions, please feel free to fire them off really quickly. So if not, I suppose that sort of ends our presentation today. If you do think of any questions that you haven't been able to ask today in the webinar, please do send those through. Contact our team. Obviously, as I said, after the webinar ends, a survey will pop up allowing you to give us some feedback, which would be really fantastic, but also to allow you to receive your complimentary consultation, and to chat to our team. Hopefully look forward to chatting with some of you soon, but in any event, really hope that this has been a helpful webinar. So thank you so much for joining and have a great day.